Hello. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how to use the elimination method. A little different than what I did in the previous video. This one, we're going to have to do a little multiplying or dividing before we do that adding or subtracting. So let's just get right to an example of solving a system of equations. So I have my red and blue. We'll focus on that one first, and then we'll get down there to the green and the purple one. But in this one, if I'm going to use the elimination method, we think back to how I taught it before, and you know that we're going to have to either add or subtract these equations to try to eliminate either the x's or the y's. Now I look at this and go, well, if I add the x's, or if I add the equations together, that doesn't get rid of the x's. If I add them together, it doesn't get rid of the y's. If I subtract them, my x's are still there. If I subtract them, my y's are still there. So that doesn't work in this situation. But if I do look a little closer at this, I notice that my x values in the blue equation is negative 8x, and in my red it's 4x. Well, if I were to just multiply the 4x by 2, it would be 8x, and then I could add those two equations together. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to take this whole second equation, and I like to just kind of write it like this, and I'm going to put that 2 out in front, and I'm going to multiply everything in that in that second equation by 2. And if I do that, I now end up with 8x plus 18y equal to 20. Now the first equation, I'm not going to do anything to that. I'm going to leave that one as is. I'm just going to clone it and then just bring that one right over here. And now I can add my two equations together. So if I add these equations, when I do that, negative 8x plus 8x is 0x. And those are gone. I've eliminated them, which is what I was looking to do. 3y plus 18y puts me at 21y, and then 22 plus 20 is 42. Now, I can solve this little equation by dividing both sides by 21, and when I divide both sides by 21, I end up with y equal to 2. I have now figured out the y value. I just need to figure out the x value. So now I get to go back and plug that y value back into one of the equations. And I can pick the original blue, the original red, or I could even plug it into my new red equation. I'll call that one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this, and I like the original red one because everything is positive in it. So I'm going to put my y value back into this one. So I will have 4 now times my y value. Oops, no, not my y value. I'm not there yet. 4x plus 9 now times my y value, which is 2, and that's going to equal 10. And now I solve this little equation. So I have 4x plus 18 equal to 10. I'm going to subtract 18 from both sides. And now I have 4x equal to negative 8. And then last but not least, I'm going to divide by 4 to find out that x equals negative 2. So I've solved that system of equations. I found out that x equals negative 2, y equals a positive 2. I could put that in, I could display that as an ordered pair. So I'd have negative 2, comma 2. Either way to display my solution would be just fine. Now in my second example, I see that I have another situation where if I add the two equations together, it doesn't get rid of my a variable or my b variable. If I were to subtract these two equations, I'm not going to eliminate the a's or the b's. So I have to do something different. I'm going to have to do like I did in my last example, where I'm going to have to multiply these equations by something. Now in the last example, all I had to do was multiply one of the equations, but in this one I'll notice that it doesn't work out nicely if I multiply the first equation by something. It's not going to, 9 times something is not going to get me to 7. 2 times something doesn't get me to 5 unless I start working with fractions or decimals, and I'd rather not do that. So what I'm going to do is I have to look at this and try to figure out which one's going to be easier for me to eliminate. I'm going to choose to eliminate the b's in this case, and here's how I'm going to eliminate those b's. I'm going to take this first equation, and I'm going to multiply it by 5, because that's going to put me at a negative 10b. Now my second equation, I'm going to multiply that one by 2, because then when I look at the b's, that's going to put me at negative 10b. So I will be able to eliminate my b variables. Now, this first equation is going to turn out to be 45a minus 10b equal to negative 35. And my second equation is going to turn out to be 14a minus 10b equal to 58. Now I look at it and go, well, if I subtract them, that will eliminate my b's, so I'm going to subtract these two equations. And when I do that, I end up with 31a, negative 10b minus negative 10b is 0, equal to, and when I subtract these, I'm going to end up at 93. Now I can solve this equation, divide both sides by 31, and I find out that a equals 3. And I made a mistake. I apologize. This is not 93. This should have been negative 93 here because we were subtracting negative 35 minus 58. It's negative 93. And then when I divide both sides by 31, I get negative 3. There we go. That's better. Now I need to take this negative 3 and plug it into one of my equations. And again, remember, it doesn't matter. You have 4 choices here. Either one of the green equations or either one of the purple equations. I think I'm going to go with the first green one. I think my numbers look a little smaller to work with, so that's why I'm going to choose that one. And I'm going to plug that a value in. So I have 9 times my a value, that's negative 3. And then minus 2b equals negative 7. And I work on solving this equation. So I'm going to have negative 27 minus 2b equal to negative 7. I'm going to add 27 to both sides. And that's going to put me at negative 2b equal to, this will be 20. And now I'm going to divide both sides by negative 2. And I just found out that b equals negative 10. B is negative 10, a is negative 3. If you wanted to display that as a point, generally speaking, we put it in alphabetical order. So my a value would be negative 3. My b value is negative 10. And I've solved that system of equations using elimination, where I had to do some multiplying before I could add or subtract. Now, my next example, I have a word problem here. It says the final exam for freshman college English is worth 145 points and contains 50 questions. Some of the questions are worth 2 points and some are worth 5 points. How many of each type of question are on the test? So I need to set up some equations to solve this. Now, before I set up the equations, I need to figure out what are my variables, define those variables. And the way I figure out what they are is I look at the question. How many of each type of question are on the test? So I have 2 different types of questions. I look up here and go, some of the questions are worth 2 points. So I have 2-point questions, and I also have 5-point questions. So one of my variables, I'm going to call it T, is going to talk about the 2-point question. So it's the number of 2-point questions. How many of them are on the test? Or on the test. And then I'm going to call my other one F, because that's going to represent the number of 5-point questions on the test. Okay. So I have that much. I've defined my variables. Now I got to look at writing those equations. I'm going to start with this part here where it says the final exam contains 50 questions. There are 50 of them on there. Well, some of them are 2-point questions and some of them are 5-point questions. How would I get to 50 total? Well, I'd have to add those numbers of questions together. So if I knew there were 10 2-point questions and 40 5-point questions, I'd just take 10 plus 40, well, that's 50. Now that's just a little example. So my first equation that I have, I'm going to write it as T plus F equals 50. Now, the next equation is going to deal with the value. So they're 145 points, or the test is worth 145 points. How do I get that? Well, I need to take and figure out how much are all the 2-point questions worth. Well, if there's, say there were 10, like I said earlier, if there were 10 2-point questions, that's 20 points in the test because we just multiplied it together. I said there were 40 5-point questions. Well, how much are those worth? Well, 40 times 5 is 200. I'd take those two numbers, add them together, and I'd have 220 points. Obviously, that's not the number of questions, so I have to figure this out. But notice what I did is I took the number of 2-point questions, I multiplied it by 2. So if I take 2 times the number of 2-point questions, I take 5 times the number of 5-point questions. If I add those together, it's going to give me the total number of points in the test, which is 145. Now I have a system of equations that I can solve. So I look at this and go, elimination looks like a pretty good method. If I would just multiply this first equation by, let's say, 2, I can then eliminate the t's. So that's what I'm going to do. Let's take that first equation and let's multiply everything in it by 2. So then I'm going to have 2t plus 2f equal to 100. The second equation, I'm just going to leave as is. So that one's just still going to be 2t plus 5f equal to 145. And now I can subtract these two equations. 2t minus 2t is 0. 2f minus 5f is negative 3f. And 100 minus 145 would be negative 45. So now to figure out what f is, I'm going to divide both sides by negative 3. And I just figured out that f equals 15. So I just figured out there's 15 5-point questions on my test. Now I just need to figure out how many 2-point questions. So I'm going to go back to my original green equation and plug it in. It tells me I'm going to have t plus the f value, which is 15, and that's going to equal 50. Solve my equation by subtracting 15 from both sides. And I just figured out that t equals 35. So now I got to answer my question. How many of each type of question are on the test? Well, there are 35 2-point questions. And there are 15 5-point questions on this test. And I have one more, another word problem, to help us practice our word problems and to look at solving systems of equations using elimination. So this one says Paul's printing projects has two kinds of printing presses. There's the Print-O-Matic, which can print 70 books per day, and there's the Excelsior, which can print 55 books per day. So if Paul owns 14 total printing presses, and this allows them to print 905 books per day, how many of each type of press do they have? So again, same thing as the previous one. The first thing I need to do is figure out what are my variables. And I look at the question, how many of each type of press do they have? Well, what kind of presses do they have? I look up here and go, well, they have the Print-O-Matic press, and we have the Excelsior. And it says how many of each. So I'm going to use P is going to stand for the number of Print-O-Matic presses. And then I'm going to use E for the number of Excelsior presses. Now I can work on writing my equations. So I look up here and go, well, what information do I have? I see that Paul owns 14 total printing presses. Owns 14 of them. Well, P of them are Print-O-Matic, E of them are Excelsior. If I add them together, that's going to have to give me the total number of presses that I have. So that would put me at P plus E equal to 14. I also have another statement in here. It says this allows them to print 905 books per day. Okay, well, how do I figure that out? Well, I look up here and go, it says the Print-O-Matic can print 70 books per day, and the Excelsior can print 55 books per day. So if I take the number of Print-O-Matic presses that I have, which is P, I multiply it by 70, that's going to tell me how many books just the Print-O-Matic presses print each day. And they do the same kind of thing with the Excelsior. Take the number of Excelsior presses I have, multiply it by 55. That'll give me the total number of books the Excelsior prints each day, or Excelsior presses print each day. And then if I add them together, it's going to equal the 905 books. So let's get down and do what I actually just said. I said we're going to take the Print-O-Matic presses, multiply it by, how many does it print each day? Well, it says up here, 70 books. So I'm going to take 70 times P. That's going to give me, remember, the number of books all of the Print-O-Matic presses print each day. And then I'm going to take the Excelsior, multiply that by how many books it prints each day, which is 55. So this part right here represents how many books just the Excelsior presses print each day. Oops, I don't know why it went back up there. And now if I add those together, it's going to be that total number of books it prints each day, which is 905. And I now have my system that I can work on solving. So I look at this and go, I can't just add or subtract them. I'm going to have to multiply one of them by something. So I'm going to take this first equation. I am going to multiply it by, 70 to get rid of the p's. So I'm going to take this first equation, multiply it by 70. And now I have 70p plus 70e equal to 980. My second one, I get to leave as is. So 70p plus 55e equals 905. And now I'm looking at this and I'm going to subtract these two to get rid of the p's. 70p minus 70p is 0. 70e minus 55e puts us at 15e. And that's going to equal 75. And now, to figure out what E is, I'm going to divide both sides by 15. And I just figured out that E equals 5. In other words, there are 5 Excelsior printers, or presses. Now I need to figure out what P is. So I'm going to take that, I'm going to plug it into the equation that I think it would be easier to work with, which would be the original green one. And I'm going to go with P plus 5 equals 14. I'll solve this little equation by subtracting 5 from both sides. And I just figured out that P equals 9. Now to answer the question, how many of each type of press do they have? Well, I know now that there are 9 Print-O-Matic presses, and there are 5 Excelsior presses that this company owns. And that's going to conclude my lesson on, I guess I didn't have the final page, but that'll conclude my lesson on the elimination method where we have to multiply or divide first.